All right, so we are looking at what we're calling Lesson 4, and tonight we're going to kind of combine. I know it's a lot of material, but we're not going to focus on every detail. We're going to focus on the main points during the reign of Solomon. And of course, one of Solomon's big accomplishments, based upon God's promise to David, was that he build this house for God. And so if you think of a building project, well, that's usually pretty significant in some way or other. But I think we will appreciate that this is more than just a building that's being produced here, some kind of beautiful building that would exist in Jerusalem for the purposes of sightseeing so others could come and see it. It was functional, but it really represented God and his presence among the people. And so it was important, but it ties into all of this that we're studying in terms of God's plan for his kingdom and for a king. So we've been looking at these two different kings, and now the third king this evening, Saul, and then David, and then this evening, Solomon. So just to back up, we've looked at the promises that are made through the Old Testament, the key promises. We could add others, but we'll just look at these three: Abraham, Moses, and David. And we've been focusing most recently on this promise made to David concerning a kingdom, concerning a house. His desire was to build a house. God says, no, you won't build the house, but your son will build a house, and your kingdom will be established forever. And so we suggested that at the outset of choosing a king, it seems as if there might be some problem with Israel choosing a king, and yet God's plan is that there is going to be a king and a kingdom, and that is according to his plan. So we'll see how all of that works out as we especially look at what happens after the kingdom divides. All right, so last time we talked a little more, and we'll just review briefly about the different histories that we have, inspired histories. 1st and 2nd Samuel, on the one hand, probably the timing of its writing is near to the time of captivity, and that's where the book ends, at the end of Jerusalem being destroyed. And so it seems to have served as a way of telling the people why they were being exiled and taken away into captivity. And it spends a lot of time talking about the different kings, the failures, the disobedience, the northern kingdom, etc. Whereas when you look at 1st and 2nd Chronicles, what you've got is a return that's even later than that, because if you read at the end of 2nd Chronicles, you've got this decree of Cyrus that is issued concerning the Israelites, that they can return from captivity. So that's down around 536 BC. And so thinking about the history as it would impact these people as they return, you have a remnant returning back to the land. Not everybody left the land, but when they get back, one of the first things they do is to rebuild the temple. It's not as glorious as the original temple was, and they might well be wondering where their king is, since God has promised a king forever after the seed of David, but there is no king on the throne. And so with all those challenges in front of them, here is a history that really, among other things, emphasizes God's faithfulness, even despite the sin of the people, the sin of the different kings that reign, and offers hope for the future. So that, yes, things might look bleak, things might look a little desolate, but can God provide for us? Well, he has before, and if he has before, then we can have confidence that he will again. We suggested last time that there's a relevance for us, even though we're several generations removed from these original readers. What is there in this for us, or is there anything? I mean, we're not reading about our captivity as such. It's not really our history, but Okay. Yeah, the need for obedience, what can happen if we are disobedient? There are going to be consequences. And then alternatively, thinking about First Chronicles, are there challenges that we face? Are there difficulties that we come across? And so the question we're going to raise is, can God help me? Can I do His will? Is it going to make a difference in the end? And I think we have many challenges like that. So there's a lot to be reminded of as we go through this. And there's a great deal of relevance for us, and we'll try to bring some more of that out as we go along, even this evening. Okay, then real quickly, let's just look at this initial history in First Chronicles, the first 9 chapters, a genealogy. We talked about it emphasizing all of Israel. So even though there's a certain group that returns back, it's not as if, okay, now we've whittled this down to just a few tribes or a few people. God's plans involve all of His people, although particularly His seed through David as far as a future king. So chapter 10, surprisingly maybe, compared to 1st and 2nd Samuel, gives us an account of Saul's death. And his body is taken. The men of Jabesh Gilead go and rescue the body, so to speak. But right at the end of chapter 10, we're told that Saul died having broken faith with God, having consulted a medium, not seeking the guidance of God. And so he was put to death and his kingdom turned over to David. So right from the get-go, one of the things we find is God set up Saul, but God took down Saul. And so it's no longer his kingdom, and God has that right, doesn't he? And so David is the one to whom this reign is given. So the rest of First Chronicles is concerned with David's reign. We won't go through all of this, but chapters 11 and 12, we talked about David's mighty men and how he gathered them from different places, some from the tribe of Benjamin, the tribe of Saul. And what's one of the points we could make about that? Or can you think of a point? That all of these mighty men are listed that David had, that followed after him. What would that say to us about David? Anything? All right, he needed them. All right, he's giving them credit. He's not taking all the credit for himself. That's certainly like David. And here are men that are loyal to him and willing to fight for him. That says something about the kind of leader that David is. And so here are the men that he surrounds himself with. And then chapters 13 to 16 have to do with moving the ark from Kiriath Jearim, where it had stayed since the Israelites had taken it out into the battle and lost it to the Philistines. The Philistines had returned it. And then ultimately it made its way to Kiriath Jearim, which is not too far from Jerusalem. But David conquers Jerusalem, a place where it can reside, and then he goes to get the ark. And what's the first thing that happens when he goes to get the ark and bring it to Jerusalem? We all know this story, right? They don't do it the right way, do they? And notice it's said in verse 3 of chapter 13 that in the days of Saul, they didn't seek the ark. So David's conscious of here's the ark out here, but the ark needs to be over here. And he tries to bring it back, but because they don't do it the way God instructs, why Uzzah is killed and the ark doesn't get back to Jerusalem just yet. And we notice that we said this ark is recognized as called by the name of the Lord. God is set to sit enthroned above the cherubim on this throne. All right, chapter 14 is kind of an interlude between chapter 13 and 15 when they're moving the ark, but it's connected because we're told about David and his family, a sign of blessing. We're also told about David and his victories, particularly over the Philistines, and we noted some of the things said about David that had not been said about Saul, such as David asked God what he should do. Saul got to the point where he wasn't asking God. And so he does as God commands him. He is able to win victories as a result. Impressive as far as David is concerned. So at the end of chapter 14 there, his kingdom is established over the entire kingdom. Jerusalem is there at the center of the kingdom. All right? And then in chapter 15, another attempt is made to bring the ark back to Jerusalem. And Levon, I think you had a detail about that you might want to share with us. Okay. First time he didn't ask God. The second time he consults God. He consults his word. They do it as it was intended to, with the ark being borne on the shoulders of the Levites. And so they successfully bring it into Jerusalem, rejoicing. Chapter 16 is this praise that David issues to God for allowing this to happen. And then when we get to chapter 17, we've got the promise that is made to David. So we said last time, among other things, David wanted to build a house for God. God says, no, I'm going to build a house for you. And by that house, he really had in mind what? A nice 3-bedroom, split-level home somewhere? No. Yeah, he's talking about David's family, David's dynasty, and that's what we're going to trace from this point onward, in addition to which his kingdom is established. It says, he shall build his house for me, a father-son relationship, so we'll get into that tonight. And then his house and kingdom will be established, confirmed. So you really get the idea that these two things are just kind of intertwined with each other. The house that the son's going to build and the throne that they're going to have and the kingdom that's going to rule, it's all connected together in a sense. Okay? So that's an important promise, and it will have to do with what happens to the rest of the Israelites' history and really beyond. So you got your sheet there. Let's just notice a few details here about these chapters that follow through the end of 1 Chronicles. So notice that we've got some more battles in chapter 18 to 20. And we won't go down through all the details, but notice here are some of those countries that were around their boundaries that we mentioned: the Philistines down along the coast, the Moabites over there on the eastern side. Not sure about Hadadezer of Zobah. Edomites are down to the south. Ammonites are over there to the east, a little farther north, and then the Philistines again. Now, David was successful in battle. I should have had a map, I don't, showing that his exploits ended up with the territory being spread. And I don't know exactly where it is. I should, but I'll ask you. Do you remember the statement that's made about David, one of the reasons why he's not going to build the house, in addition to, God says you're not? Yeah, he was a man of war, a man of blood. Now that might sound like something negative, especially, but that doesn't make a lot of sense because God's the one that seems to send him out on some of these battles. And I think that the sense is more that David is busy sort of consolidating the kingdom as God intended. And so he does all of that so that they can reach a point where there is rest, during which then his son can build this temple. More so than David did something wrong by being this man that's going out and fighting. Okay? So chapters 18 to 20 have to do with that. Now, chapter 21, we won't spend a lot of time here. Interesting event that takes place, also mentioned over in 2 Samuel. You remember what David's sin was? I know you probably haven't had a chance to look at this, but what did David do that God didn't want him to do? He took a census. And we could talk a lot about, okay, what was wrong with taking a census? There were times when Israel took a census. God told them to take a census. It seems to be that maybe David was relying too much upon his pride and his armies, and so he wanted to count them. At any rate, God says, you sinned against me, and gives him an option of 3 punishments that he can receive. The first was 3 months of famine. The second was 3 3 weeks, 3 days of being pursued by his enemies. Let me see if I can find this. You're right. 3 years of famine, so 3 months of devastation by his foes, or 3 days of pestilence at the hands of God. Remember which one David chooses? The last one. Seems like he wants to put himself upon the mercy of God, he says. And God actually is merciful, because in the middle of this pestilence, he stops that. And David is there in this city of where the Jebusites had been, Jerusalem. And God tells him to make sacrifice. And there is a man by the name of Ornan the Jebusite who has a threshing floor there. That's where you take your grain to have it, the wind blow the chaff away. And so David wants to give sacrifice to God for what he's done for him, David. And Ornan offers to give it to him, but you remember what David says? Yeah. Okay, and verse 24 of chapter 21 in Chronicles, King David said to Ornan, "No, but I will buy them for the full price. I will not take for the Lord what is yours, nor offer burnt offerings that cost me nothing." You know, I'm not going to get a bargain rate on this so that I can save some money in offering these sacrifices. He wants to do what he needs to do. Okay, so that's kind of how this resolves itself, but the importance of that is this ends up being the place upon which the house is going to be built, the temple is going to be built, is this threshing floor that he has purchased. And so that makes way for this place to be built. Chapter 22, verse 1, David said, "Here shall be the house of the Lord God, and here the altar of burnt offering for Israel." All right? Now, the rest of 1 Chronicles, chapters 22 through 29, are all concerned with David making provision for his son Solomon to one day build this temple. Okay? What is that, 8 chapters, 9 chapters? So, if we didn't know anything else about that, what might that suggest to us about this matter of building the temple? Big job. That's good. Big job. And what else might you say about that? And I think we'll see that as we look at a few of the details. Big job and important, and David wants to do a good job, doesn't he? Okay, he's not going to skimp on this. Look at chapter 22, verse 5 here. "For David said, Solomon, my son, is young and inexperienced, and the house that is to be built for the Lord must be exceedingly magnificent, of fame and glory throughout all lands. I will therefore make preparation for it." Okay, so we'll hang on to that thought, because I think we've got another place here where some other things are said about the kind of place that it's going to be. All right, in chapter 22, David makes a speech to Solomon. And basically, this is his recounting what God said to him and what God wants him to do. So now he's telling his son. But I want you to notice down in verse 13 of chapter 22, "Then you will prosper if you are careful to observe the statutes." That's really going to be the refrain all the way through Chronicles, not just for these kings, but the kings that come afterwards. You need to keep the statutes of God. Does that ring a bell as far as anything that God had said previously? That was Samuel's word to the people when they said, "We want a king." He said, "Well, you need a king that'll do this." And that was God's word back in Deuteronomy 17. Notice in addition, he says, "Be strong and courageous." Who's that remind us of? Joshua. Same kind of instructions. And so he says, "With great pains I've provided for the house of the Lord," different things. So we'll we'll look at some of those. Look down at verse 19, because these are some important words that are going to surface time and again throughout 2 Chronicles. He says, now set your mind and heart to seek the Lord your God. That's kind of a magic formula. It's not magic. It'll work wonders. Set your mind to seek the Lord your God. And another key word back up in verse 17, David also commanded all the leaders of Israel to help Solomon his son. Okay, the idea of helping. So these are key ideas that take part in the building of the temple, but we're going to see them afterwards with some of these other kings that rule in the south. Okay, chapters 23 to 26, we're not going to look at detail here, but I want you to just notice, survey up here on the slide, you've got David organizing things. He does take a census of the Levites. The clans of the Levites are mentioned. Why would that be important? Yeah, the Levites are the ones who serve in the temple. We're getting ready to build a temple. We want to make sure they're organized. And then notice under the groups of Levites, Levites at the temple, priests and Levitical assistants, musicians, chapter 25, gatekeepers, so there's some security that's involved in this, and then treasurers. There were things that were stored in order to be used, both for materials and then later used as sacrifices, etc. So there's a lot of organization that takes place according to this. And then chapter 27, these are not so much the Levites here, the army, tribes, kings, but David goes to great pains to sort of organize these individuals. Okay, look at chapter 28. And after all this organizing, let's see here. David assembles everyone together. And again, up there in verse 2, he repeats the same sorts of things that God had said to him. And then he repeats those to Solomon that, we're going to build a house. All of this is in keeping with this covenant that God has made. So yeah, it's repeated a lot of times. The reason being, it's kind of the center of everything that's being accomplished here. And so in verse 9, now listen to the charge he makes to Solomon. And you, Solomon, my son, know the God of your father and serve him with a whole heart and with a willing mind, for the Lord searches all hearts and understands every plan and thought. If you seek him, he will be found by you, but if you forsake him, he will cast you off forever. Why is that important? Can you think of a part of that promise made to David that would kind of bear that out? He said, I'll be a father and he'll be a son. And what could happen? I don't have that queued up here, but back there in chapter 17. Let me see if I can find it real quick. Okay, 1 Chronicles 17, all these. In fact, it might not even be in this particular part. Verse 13, I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. I will not take my steadfast love from him as I took it from him who was before you, but I will confirm him in my house and my kingdom forever. I think in 2 Samuel 7, he says if he doesn't say disobey, but he says something, he says, I will chastise it. Okay? So my point is, God had said to David, if he steps out of line, he's going to be corrected. And that's what David is telling Solomon back here in 1 Chronicles 28, that if you disobey, then there are going to be repercussions as a result of that. Okay, verse 11 of chapter 28, listen to this. Then David gave Solomon, his son, the plan of, and you can go from there, several verses, the vestibule, the houses, etc., etc. Okay, so what's that telling us about David and his preparation? He gave him the plan, the blueprint, okay? Well, where did David get that blueprint from? He got it from God. Drop down to verse 19. All this he made clear to me in writing from the hand of the Lord, all the work to be done according to the plan. David had a plan. David was prepared. But David didn't think this plan up himself. David got the plan from God, which reminds us of whom as far as the tabernacle? Moses went up into the mountain to get the plan about the tabernacle in order to build the tabernacle. Same thing happens here. Okay, let me check one other thing. Well, I had some other point I wanted to make, but we'll leave that for now. Okay, so David's making preparation. He's doing this according to God. He's highly organized. And then look what happens in chapter 29. Chapter 29 is an expression of praise and thanksgiving to God. We sometimes read this, rightfully so, if we're thinking about the collection, because of what it expresses and what David expresses to God in terms of what he's done. So look at verse 10. Blessed are you, O Lord, the God of Israel, our Father, forever and ever. Yours, O Lord, is the greatness and the power and the glory and the victory and the majesty. For all that is in the heavens and in the earth is yours. Yours is the kingdom, O Lord, and you are exalted as head above all. Both riches and honor come from you, and you rule over all. In your hand are power and might, and in your hand it is to make great and to give strength to all. Okay, so he continues along that line. The other thing I was going to mention, I don't know how the reference here. One of the things David did during all those battles, guess what he did with the spoil? He saved it up as use for materials in order to build the temple. I mean, not every single thing he had, but some of that he used as a resource for the building of this temple. All right, so here he gives thanks to God for all that God has done, and we could read through the entire section. We won't do that right now, but that's chapter 29 is a wonderful expression of praise to God and thanksgiving from about verse 10 down through about verse 20 there. All right, so at the end of chapter 29, Solomon is anointed king, and David dies there at the end of the chapter. And so we turn over to 2 Chronicles, and the first 8 chapters, kind of like the first 8 chapters of 1 Kings, are concerned with Solomon, his reign, but particularly Solomon building the temple. So let's spend a few minutes on that before we close this evening. And we had some questions about chapter 1. Let me see. Which include Solomon going up to Gibeon, which was north of Jerusalem. And I want you to notice in verse 5, when he goes up to Gibeon, what's at Gibeon? If you look, the tent of meeting, and also the bronze altar that's there, okay, which I take to be this altar of burnt offering. And notice what it says, verse 5. Moreover, the bronze altar that Bezalel, the son of Uri, son of Hur, had made. Okay, so that's going all the way back to the wilderness. And this man, Bezalel, was chosen as the man who was God graced with wisdom and might in order to build these things. Well, it says he's the one that made this, and then notice the very next part of the verse, and Solomon and the assembly sought it out, and Solomon went up there to the bronze altar before the Lord, which was at the tent of meeting, and offered 1,000 burnt offerings on it. So it's almost as if here is someone God had chosen way back there in the Exodus to build these pieces of furniture, etc. And now Solomon is going to be God's person to build the temple and all that's included with it. And as a part of that, if you drop down to verse 7, we all kind of know this story. Solomon prays to God, or God appears to Solomon and asks him what he wants. And of course, what was his request? Okay, he wants to rule with wisdom. Okay, let me catch up here. All right. And so God says what? As a result of asking for wisdom, he says, I'm going to give you wisdom, but I'm also going to give you what? Verse 12. Wisdom, knowledge, riches, possession, honor, such as none like any king before. Okay, let's think for a moment about that. So what about Solomon's choice? Wise? Okay. Was this something miraculous that was taking place here? He asked for wisdom, and God says, oh, I'll give you wisdom. I'll give you riches. I'll give you possessions. Are we talking about the miraculous that God's granting? No. Okay. Yeah, no indication that this is going to be a miraculous bestowal upon him, but he certainly does benefit as a result of this. Let's put ourselves in that boat. Well, what about me? I have an opportunity to ask God for something. Do I have that opportunity? Yeah. So what would we ask God for? What do we ask God for? Could we ask him for wisdom? Yeah. Okay. So, okay. Okay, good. So as situations change in our lives and we find ourselves in different circumstances, there might be different things for which we need to ask wisdom. Sometimes we might need to ask wisdom because, we're being tested and I need some wisdom. And, God promises if we ask for wisdom, he'll give it to us. And our faith will be stronger as a result. So when you think about Solomon, I mean, it's impressive what Solomon did, certainly in terms of his request, but that's not all that far removed from us, is it? In terms of opportunities we have and what God wants us to have and what would we ask for? And will God give that to us? Interesting to think about those possibilities there. Yes. Okay. 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 Michael? Okay.
Therefore, it takes some of the skepticism out of the answer. If we put our faith that God knew what he was asking, and the person that he was posing the question to.
Okay. All right.
And we ourselves have to consider that same perspective.
Right. Right.
If we come to God with less than pure motives, less than pure intentions, and ask, will we receive what we ask for?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, he promises that he'll give us wisdom, and our attitude has to be right. And I think all of us desire that. So it's, part of the point is it's not so far removed, is it? That we find ourselves in similar situations, not necessarily about wealth, possessions, etc. Although we might ask for wisdom in using what we do have, but certainly worth pondering. Okay, real quickly, let's just look at the rest of this. So his wealth described there, I had some pictures of the temple. We won't spend a lot of time on that, other than to say the temple was bigger than the tabernacle, and more basins, more lampstands, etc. But it was a grand structure, certainly. So chapter 10, Solomon makes preparation for this. And then chapters 3 to 5, or the start of chapter 5, he begins building the temple. What I want us to notice here as we close is, what happens once the temple is completed? Look at chapter 5, verse 2. Well, it says they brought these different things into the ark. Look down at verse 13 or 14, chapter 5, verse 13 or 14. Yeah. So it says they were singing thanksgiving, trumpets, cymbals, musical instruments, and praise to the Lord in the house of the Lord, and says was filled with a cloud, so that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled the house of God. Now, let's compare that with, down in chapter 7, I believe it is, verse 1, Solomon prays, and that prayer is worth looking at, but we don't have time right now. After his prayer, look at verse 1 of chapter 7. As soon as Solomon finished his prayer, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offering and the sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. So in both cases, what's happening? Okay, God's manifesting his presence among the people, isn't he? And it's just like he did back when the tabernacle was finished and completed. And now they've spent all of this time and all of this expense and all these materials building this temple, which God has asked Solomon to build, and now God fills it with his glory. Okay? So this is a momentous occasion. You know, Solomon is now sitting on the throne. We didn't look at that part of it. First Kings traces, kind of the uprising among one of the sons of David. Was it Adonijah that tried to usurp the throne? But Solomon is given the throne. So Solomon begins to rule, and then Solomon completes the building of the temple. And that was a big deal, wasn't it? That's what God intended. Okay, so we're at that point. We're out of time tonight, but we will start next time and look at the divide of the kingdom, what happens. And again, this is going to be kind of an overall view, but we're going to just try to trace through some themes as we go through and see what God's plan was, what God's intention. And then after that lesson, we'll concentrate on the southern kingdom for the next 2 or 3.